Today, we are hosting this event from Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape, and we recognize New York City as the past, present, and future crossroads for many Indigenous peoples. And we thank you for joining us today. I'm Kay Matchlot, and I am the founding producer director of Media Art Exploration, and known as MAX, and we produce and present live immersive arts that harness and interrogate the scientific innovations that so impact us every day, and more so, seemingly every day. We present a biennial festival around a particular scientific mission, and this year we are focused on the explosion of intelligences, both human and non-human. Machines, people, whales, we are gleaning intelligence, we are gleaning understanding of these intelligences. And well, we're creating a new intelligence hosted by a machine. So at MAX, we love to dive deeply into the perils and promise of these technologies. So we're happy to have you join us today in that dive. Today's a particularly wonderful dive, I would say. And we strive to get a greater understanding of these technologies, and so therefore we can hopefully co-opt them for a more sustainable future. And I want to thank our funders for this series, the Science Sandbox, an initiative of the Simons Foundation. And we have, in addition to them, their generosity makes this possible. In addition to them, we have a very generous anonymous individual donor we want to say thank you to out there. And we want to thank our presenting partner, 1014, A Space for Ideas. So I want to thank all the audience for coming today and sharing your time with us. It's, you know, there's a lot of Zoom fatigue, so we really appreciate your time on this Sunday afternoon. Today, our clocks move back where I am, and I only bring this up because it means the vernal equinox is just around the corner, and I'm hoping this will mean both for the world a literal and metaphorical of opening and light, more light and more opening. And we're optimistically looking forward to that. And we look forward to your joining us physically in the fall at the Neuroverse Festival, our festival about intelligences. So this conversation today is the second in our inaugural MAXforum series. Our third is April 18th, and we invite you to join us. It is The Imagination and the Scientist. And artist Philip Schmidt, one of our artists in our Max Machina cohort, who's creating a piece for the Neuroverse Festival called How Does Thinking Look Like? A really one-of-a-kind live arts multimedia piece. He will be in conversation with Dr. Nyla Murray, and Dr. Murray is a senior researcher at Facebook AI and one of the world's greatest minds in computer vision. And she, in her academic career, has looked at some of the thorniest questions facing engineers, both creative challenges and ethical challenges. And we really look forward to having her and Philip in conversation. In his piece, he looks at the imagination of the engineer and the scientist. How do you imagine the thousands of dimensions of machine learning? And if we can't imagine those thousands of dimensions, how do we make them? So it's a wonderful duo to come together around that question of the imagination and the scientist. So join us the 18th for that. Today, we have incredible four minds with us. I'm really delighted to have them all here and to introduce them to you. We have composer-performer Annie, and I would say alchemist, actually, Annie Lewandowski. And we have code artist Kyle Mcdonald, who is a great creative technologist, but also a philosopher, I would say. And curator Lucia Pietroiusti, who has been, I would say, one of the masterminds behind eco-curating and a whole new awareness and what can I say, global relevance for artistic curating. And finally, we have Ashley Lewis, who is in her own right, a wonderful artist and catalyst for change, I would say. And she will be guiding the conversation. And before I go hand it over, I just want to say this conversation has deep resonance for me. I founded Max 3+ years ago, inspired to bring humanist artists to the table with artists, the perspective of scientists and engineers. So I wanted to bring those groups together. And as I've gone on this journey, my definition of humanism has changed. And I realized there is no humanism without an awareness of non-human species and without embracing the majesty of non-human species. We will in fact perish if we don't embrace non-human intelligence and life. And like Katie and Roger Payne with the first humpback whale recordings they made in the 70s, they took these tangible recordings and they played for the world these songs that move across the oceans, vibrate, transform, and traverse the thousands of miles of oceans that separate humpback whales. So they shared the creativity and the beauty of these songs, and thereby they spawned the Save the Whales movement. And today we are at a new day of reckoning with our whales populations. So I invite you today to listen to these artists and thinkers and take on these songs into your soul. And I invite you to come to the Neuroverse to see Siren, the piece that Annie and Kyle are creating for the festival, which celebrates the humpback whales and our greater understanding of them and the way machine learning is helping us to better understand these whale songs. So it's a siren. You should not ignore the call. You should not ignore the call of this siren. So please join us at the Neuroverse and for the siren in the fall. And with that, I hand it over to Ashley. Thank you so much for bringing your talent to the table today, Ashley.
Thanks, Kay. I'm thrilled, just really ecstatic to be able to host this conversation with you all. We've had the pleasure of touching base as a panel in the days coming up to this. And if today's conversation is anything like that, I'm sure you're all going to walk away with something I think that feels a lot more expansive than what you came with. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for myself. I'm a new media artist and a creative technologist. I spend a ton of time exploring and thinking about interspecies work, usually through the collaborations with an incredible artist named Io Conciende. We co-created the Slime Tech Lab, which is depicted here on the slide. And through this project, we create collaborations with slime mold. Slime mold being this beautiful neon yellow bioorganism that you can see down at the bottom of the screen. It is, in fact, not the children's toy. If I had $1 for every time people signed up for slime mold, workshops with the anticipation that they were going to make this super popular kids toy, I would be pretty rich. But luckily, slime mold, the bioorganism, is also really spectacular. And with computer vision and machine learning, we spend quite an enormous amount of time helping ourselves as multi-species explore new narratives, explore new conversations around the diaspora, what it means to be othered, conversations around immigration. And we're really excited to be working in collaboration with the slime mold in this way. So that's a little bit of context around my work, and you can see more at theslimetechlab.org. And I'll pass it over to the next panelist.
It's me. Hi. So my name is Lucia Pietroiusti, and I think you may have given me slightly too much credit. I'm just a curator, but I do work a lot with the intersection of art and ecology. And specifically, I work at my main sort of job is at the Serpentine Gallery, which is a not-for-profit gallery in London, where in 2018, I sort of wrote a project into the galleries as almost like a prototype or tiny little piece of code to put inside the way that an organization worked to see if it would be possible to kind of reroute part of its effort or part of its mission towards environmental justice and environmental balance. And in relation to this conversation, and it's such a joy to be in conversation with you all, Ashley, Kyle, and Annie, it's really such an honor because these are thoughts that preoccupy me a lot, the relationship between human and more than human intelligence, consciousness, generosity, and all kinds of other properties that you can imagine as being not only human, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And one of the projects that I've been working on a lot in relation to this, together with a writer called Filipa Ramos, has been a festival series and a research project and a publication soon to be called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish. And I will tell you just a little bit about that title because I think it speaks a little bit to that space of untranslatability. The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish is inspired by those beautiful circles in the sand that pufferfish make when they, according to David Attenborough at least, when they're looking for a mate. And they make these enormous circles that we recognize as a pattern that we could recognize perhaps even as art. But when you look at the scale, it's very hard to imagine that the fish conceives of the shape through the same coordinates that we do when we then interpret the circle. And we were thinking more about this kind of little shuffle that the fish does as it's moving the sand around with its fins and doing this whole kind of quite funny, quite charming thing, and realized, well, it might be that that shape in that circle in the mind of that fish actually manifests itself more as a set of movement coordinates, almost like a dance, than it does as an image. And so how to think of something about, how to think of something that is both, let's say, a dance and an image, what are those kinds of interesting gaps of translation that can emerge out of that? And so we've brought together participants from literally all the disciplines to think about consciousness in a more than human context. Another part of my job has been to accompany the life of this opera performance that you see on the right, Sun and Sea Marina, which is an opera performance by 3 Lithuanian artists, Rugile Bardziukaitė, Vaiva Granite, and Lina Lapelytė. And it again speaks to your work, my dear co-panelists, in as much as through the operatic, through the chorus, through sound, this is an opera that sees people. And if you want, Mariam, you could perhaps play it. I can probably speak over it. But this is an opera that brings that you see from the top down, and it brings these sort of bathers at the beach doing whatever it is that they're doing. The stage directions are actually to just be at the beach, but the beach is indoors and artificially lit. And as they sing their sort of daily life worries, you know, kind of mundane, whatever thoughts of nothing, you feel and you sense this emerging kind of under current of climate anxiety. And so it's both a piece in which, as you experience it, you realize that that's us actually watching the climate crisis unfold in actually quite an unequally distributed way, and are doing absolutely nothing about it. So here are kind of two aspects of my work, and I'm looking so much forward to speaking with you all. That's probably good.
Thank you, Lucia. Beautiful. Thank you so much. We're really looking forward to diving into those themes. And I think there's a lot of overlap, as you alluded to. So I think the next introduction will show a lot of that correlation, and I'll pass it over to Annie. Annie may be experiencing technical difficulties, perhaps. Maybe we should jump to Kyle, and then we'll come back to Annie.
Hi, my name's Kyle. I'm here near Ballona Creek in Tongva Land in Los Angeles. I'm working with Annie to develop a new way of appreciating humpback whale songs. And I want to say thanks to Max for organizing this conversation and to all the co-panelists. My work spans all the way from large-scale installations to very personal performance pieces. In this video at the top left, you can see this piece called Light Leaks, where I worked with Jonas Jongyan to project onto disco balls and map every single reflection of light that bounces off into the room. This allowed us to control the space like a big LED display. So the technology that is in my work in this kind of situation is kind of a complex process of calibration, and it involves computer vision. But when the whole thing's finished, it it's not really the technology on display. It's more like this magical coincidence that you have the chance to just stand in awe of. The technology is kind of hidden from view. I try and take advantage of repetition and multiplicity in my work in a way that gives me a chance to explore kind of order within chaotic systems, which I feel like is representative of a lot of our interaction with technology. So at the bottom left is a piece called Social Soul with Lauren Mccarthy. It's an immersive installation that tries to create, we wanted to create this feeling of like being inside someone else's mind. So we, and this feeling of like being overwhelmed by the digital world. So first the visitor types in their social media username, and then the installations show all their text and images in rapid succession with text to speech, bringing their words to life in the space. And all this content is used to pair the visitor to the space with another similar person who had previously been through the space before. And the installation sends both of them a tweet or a message saying, you know, you've been paired up, you're social soulmates. So if you and your friend go through the space and you tend to post about the same things, it might pair you up with each other. Sometimes I work also as a kind of technical and creative consultant. So those two projects on the right are both with Google Creative Lab, where I was working independently as a kind of advisor and technical on some technical implementation. The top right, that's with Cornell Lab of Ornithology to organize North American bird songs. We use this algorithm called Umap, which organizes data by putting similar data close together and dissimilar data far apart. You can think of Umap as being kind of like the first step of solving a jigsaw puzzle, where you sort of dump all the pieces on the table and you kind of like group them around a little bit based on their visual similarity. Umap is a machine learning algorithm that does that automatically. I also worked with Google Creative Lab and the American Ocean Science Agency, NOAA, to find patterns in many terabytes of humpback whale songs, and that's at the bottom right. These were recordings that represented decades of kind of underwater history. And the scientists who regularly work with this data are really intimately familiar with the nuances of animal vocalizations and the entire underwater soundscape as a whole. And they use this really specialized software for processing this audio and analyzing these recordings. But my ears are more kind of trained for experimental music, and my tools come more from the machine learning or computer vision world for interactive installations and other kinds of media art. So my goal wasn't to kind of replace the scientific work here, but and not to answer a specific question or build a specific tool, but to kind of explore like new kinds of analysis that might help us build a deeper appreciation for what we're hearing when we hear humpback whale songs. So I met Annie through this project, both of our contributions to this project called Pattern Radio, the one at the bottom right with NOAA and Google. And we're also using Umap right now to explore humpback whale songs on our new project, Siren.
Incredible. Thank you so much. I think Miriam, Miriam's going to play or take us to the next slide, and Annie is back with us now. So I'll pass, that's all right, no problem. I'll pass it over to Annie.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley. So I'll tell you briefly a little bit about how I got involved with humpback song. In 2017, I began meeting with bioacoustics researcher Katie Payne, who also lives here where I live in Ithaca, New York. As someone who composes pieces of music and also improvises, I was interested in learning about how the humpback song evolves, which Katie made important discoveries about. At any given time, all of the humpbacks in a population sing the same song, which differs from the song sung in other humpback populations. There are 14 different populations in the world. Katie and her colleagues discovered that the song of a population evolves continuously, progressively, and so quickly that changes can be measured from month to month in a singing season. In my meetings with Katie, so I learned not only about the evolution of humpback song, but I also learned about the role of humpback song in the modern environmental movement, which Katie and Roger Payne played a key part in facilitating. Katie and Roger co-produced Songs of the Humpback Whale, which is the best-selling nature recording of all time. It went multi-platinum. And through this recording, the Paynes realized that sharing with the world the very fact that whales sing in addition to the beauty of their songs, provided an opportunity to change the way that people perceived whales. And indeed, following the release of this record, as Kay mentioned, groups organized, conservationists organized internationally to get involved in the Save the Whales movement, which resulted ultimately in the global moratorium on commercial whaling. So this rich education was all wrapped up in my meetings with Katie. Jumping ahead to 2019, I traveled to Hawaii with Katie through funding from the Atkinson Center for Sustainability to record humpbacks during the height of the breeding season when the song is at its fullest. Over a 2-week period, we had the pleasure of working with the Hawaii Marine Mammal Consortium, marine research, education, and conservation organization on Hawaii's Big Island, documenting several different humpback singers. Here on my slide, you can see Katie and I listening from the boat, both with the aid of a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, and also when conditions were quiet on the water through the hull of the boat. The hull acts as a kind of sounding board to help sounds pass from water to air when a humpback singer is in close proximity. There you also see a photo of my feet poking out of the water, listening in the medium where the song is produced. Each kind of listening experience was really rich and unique, which I'm happy to describe in detail later if we get around to it. So recordings with the hydrophone, which we made many of in this period, provided us with really extraordinary detail of the humpback song. 10,000 humpbacks come to Hawaii during the breeding season. And when you lower a hydrophone in the water, you can hear humpbacks up to tens of miles away, all singing the same evolving song asynchronously. So in the first audio I'd like to share from this trip, you'll hear a full iteration, just one moment, you'll hear a full iteration of one phrase from theme 4 from that season's song, as well as the beginning of another iteration of that phrase. Phrases repeat to form themes. There were 5 themes in this population song during the period that I was studying them, and these 5 themes are tinkered with by these male humpback singers. So let's listen to one whale. So hopefully the audio communicates not only the foreground soloist, but also gives you a sense of the richness of the ocean soundscape filled with humpback singers during this time. The image of the humpback that you see here is the singer that you heard the recording of, who started breaching mid-theme 4 one cycle later into our recording of him. This photo was taken by the Marine Mammal Consortium. So in a moment, I'd like to share with you 2 whales. So this was only our second day out on the water when we made the recording of the 2 whales singing, and we found ourselves positioned kind of amazingly between two humpbacks that were singing. And this recording gives you a real sense of the asynchronous delivery of the song. One whale is singing theme 2 while the other is singing theme 3. And if you really tune in, you can perhaps tell them apart because the amplitude of one is greater than the other. Could you play 2 whales, please? So this collection of audio is what inspired the beginnings of my collaboration with Kyle. And returning to Ithaca, my vision was to create an immersive piece using these humpback recordings that gave listeners not only a sense of space, of the oceanic abyss, immersing them in this song, but also provided some insight into the distinct creative minds of each of these individual singers. I had the real great pleasure of exploring approaches to spatializing this audio in a chapel, a big chapel at Cornell, with my colleagues in Ithaca, engineer Bill McQuay, composer Kevin Ernst, and architect Kent Hubble. And as I began collaborating with Kyle, the meeting of intelligences grew from humpback and human to include artificial through Kyle's really incredible talents and skill set. And we imagine our piece, which is very much still in progress, which is called Siren, as a 21st century telling of songs of the humpback whale on its 50th anniversary, giving listeners new insight into the creative minds of humpback singers by integrating human and machine learning perspectives, while also sounding the alarm on a major and unseen contemporary threat to marine mammal populations in the form of bycatch. 650,000 cetaceans, so that's whales, dolphins, and porpoises, are killed every year unintentionally through their entanglement in fishing gear. And this is as shocking of a number as it sounds. So that's 1,780 per day, 74 during the hour of this webinar alone. Just as Songs of the Humpback Whale drew attention to the intentional killing of whales through commercial whaling, through Siren, we're hoping to draw attention to the unintentional and no less devastating killing of whales through marine entanglement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie, and all panelists. That was a really spectacular introduction to the work, and to be left with Annie's really salient points around how these animals are being affected even inside of this panel's time allotment is just like enough to give you goosebumps. And so Siren is going to be available to see at Max's Live Art Festival, the Neuroverse, this coming fall. So if you also have goosebumps from what Annie just described, you can experience it in greater depth in the fall. So with all of that incredible context provided, I think that there are just so many different kinds of ways that we could begin this conversation, but I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are likely thinking and wondering how you got to this place of being able to explore, being interested in exploring interspecies work, especially because all of your disciplines are so different. And so I was wondering if we could begin by just discussing how you came to be in a position to go on some of these journeys that involve interspecies collaboration and interspecies work. Maybe we could begin with you, Lucia, how your creative exploration in this field began.
I think it probably began as a part of, well, winding back just ever so slightly from what I was about to say, the General Ecology project, so that project in 2018 that tried to just obsessively program things on the intersection of art and ecology in an art institution until there was enough to sort of convince both our audiences and then the institution itself that it was actually an organization dedicated to those intersections, or at least in part dedicated to those intersections. Just before that, I had had a baby, and I realized something really that hadn't occurred to me about interspecies communication. In the simple and obvious fact that caring for one happened much before being able to communicate with one did. And so that little stretch outwards allowed for, you multiply it enough times and you're making little stretches further. And somehow that I over-intellectualized the experience of motherhood and found myself reading a lot of really mostly anthropologists and theologians who were very particularly dedicated to climate justice, and found myself in that kind of territory. And so the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish symposium was really a way of like picking away at assumptions that go together with centering the human, kind of we'll get to that, but like not all humans, but let's say a human-centered viewpoint. And we picked away at things like you need language to communicate, whether you have it, you don't. You need, you know what you mean. We know what we mean when we say I. Well, we are this assemblage of hundreds of thousands, billions, in fact, of little micro other organisms that constitute ourselves. So we don't actually know what we mean when we say I, and other such things. So we're kind of unpicking slowly, and the work continues.
Thank you. What about you, Annie? How did you come to be in this opportunity to create this beautiful piece of work?
Yeah, thank you. So I am a composer and an improviser, and I write songs. And as Katie visited a class I teach at Cornell to speak about acoustic communication in elephants and in whales, and hearing her speak about them and speak about the evolving song, I was kind of struck by the kind of experience of in the evolving song of this sort of voice sort of auditioning new material that may or may not sort of be absorbed by the population as the song evolves. And I teach an improvisation ensemble at Cornell, and there's a lot of auditioning new material to see whether it's going to work or not musically, as anyone who plays music is kind of trying to find their way, improvising on an instrument, working with sound in any sort of way. And so there was this sort of great empathy, I feel like, between this process of how the song evolves in Humpbacks, and then also kind of in my own musical journey, but also kind of the kind of point of view you have when you're a teacher also, which is really rich for me. And so I found this sort of remarkable empathy that I wanted to explore further.
I love that. And there's no way to have this conversation without returning to words like empathy. So we'll absolutely be circling back to that. And Kyle, how about you? How did you get to this position?
Sure, yeah, it was through a friend, Alexander Chen, another artist I was working with. We have kind of an ongoing discussion about the possibilities in between machine learning and sound and music. And he had just moved to the woods, basically, to the forest, and in the Northeast US. And he kind of became a bird watcher accidentally very quickly. Or I think I like what artist Jenny Odell says. She calls it bird noticing instead of bird watching. I think we started talking about how we could work with those bird sounds in the context of some of these machine learning tools, and kind of gain broader appreciation in this moment where we were both kind of opening up our ears to our environment a little bit. Yeah, I really immediately connected with kind of my own love for noise music. I've made a lot of weird songs and sounds in the past, and birds are out there. They're some of the best improvisers on the planet, and have some of the best compositions to share. So yeah, that's really where it started for me, is just working with bird songs.
Amazing. And I really love the kinds of elements that everybody's drawing forward about the animals that they are exploring. And I think one of the things that's impossible to miss is how much appreciation there is for the sounds that could be correlated to songs. I mean, we're a very sound, speech, singing oriented species, and it seems like sounds, of course, are something we're so drawn to in birds and in whales. And I guess it kind of makes me wonder and maybe this is a silly question, but are there elements of these species that are easier for us as humans to tap into, to empathize with, because they represent things that our human species experience? Motherhood, you see that is so obviously demonstrated inside of the way that whales parent, and the way that elephants exhibit affection and care for their youth, and the way that birds sing. Is there a correlation between our ability to tap in and feel connected and feel like, even enraged on behalf of these creatures that exhibit sensibilities that are closer to the humankind?
I'll jump in for a minute here. So yeah, Roger Payne writes about this really beautifully in his book, Among Whales, and that although whales and humans have been on these separate but parallel evolutionary paths for millions of years, there are these laws of musical composition that are very similar in each. For example, whales use patterning in a way that's very similar to human music. There's the hierarchical structure, cycles of song that are repeated. The length of a humpback song is between, at the extremes, 5 and 35 minutes of music. So it's kind of, think of like pop song to art music. It kind of fulfills that whole range there. And then the frequency range that they sing in is about the same as what you find on the length of a piano. So there's a lot of sort of the perceptual range and kind of how we organize music, there's a lot of similarity between humpbacks and humans. And like Kyle, I'm really drawn to experimental music, and for me, listening to the timbre of the sounds that they make, it just sounds absolutely like a lot of music that I enjoy listening to, free jazz and post-free jazz.
I think something, Ashley, your question reminds me of too, is like the more that I learn to open my ears, both to, you know, underwater recordings, but also just to my environment around me, the more I wonder, you know, what am I not hearing, and where are those creatures that have either gone, like they've been lost, they're extinct, or they've retreated from this environment, and where are the creatures that you know, aren't charismatic, the creatures that don't have some song to sing to communicate with us, but they communicate in another way, or they inhabit our environment, or we're related to them by some other means. Yeah, I think part of the process for me is not just learning to kind of expand my appreciation for what I can hear, but to also kind of learn the new ways that I'm related to other creatures that are maybe not kind of throwing themselves in my ears.
Right. And I think that's really such an incredible point to bring up, because there are the ways in which the whales are suffering is not completely unlike the way that other creatures are suffering, creatures that don't have eyes and ears and tonalities that our ears can perceive. And I think that it's very interesting to see the way that art and science about whales speaks to us in a way that amoebas, E. coli, slime mold does not speak to us, perhaps even creates a completely inverse effect, viscerally uncomfortable by these kinds of things that don't embody our kinds of like, you know, anthropomorphic proportions. And I know, Lucia, you talk a lot about this in your work, thinking around the spectrum of more than human. And are there ways in which the physical form of the species produces more engagement from human beings? Like, is there a science behind that?
I'm not entirely sure, but I suppose one of the ways into that untranslatable canyon, or actually there are many ways into that, but all of them somehow point back to some kind of generalized sense of vibrancy, or certain kinds of equivalences, like people who've had some extremely intense, you know, mystical experiences or psychedelic experience will talk about divinity and love and the more than human as one and the same. And you don't have to do psychedelics to get there. You know, you can do all kinds of breathing and physical practices. You don't even have to do that. You can just read about it. But you still kind of, you start to sense something that is definitely not related to the shape that is emitting it somehow. And I would actually like to take that anthropomorphism that you've mentioned in relation to charismatic megafauna and raise it some kind of potential future radical complete anthropomorphism, not as a way of recentering, of kind of applying human principles onto not more than human species, but more as a way of recognizing that whatever we consider to be a human principle, song and love and generosity and humor and what have you, may very well be that we've defined it in a way that we recognize. We've defined it in our own image, like some people in the, you know, over the millennium have changed the shape in which, say, God appears, but God is a non or more than human entity. I'm not religious, by the way, I keep talking about religion, but that the hypothesis there could be that we've actually come to define all these principles in our own image, but in fact, all those principles in humans just emerge from more complex and more than human things. Like, why is it wrong to say that a forest is not capable of chanting, for example? So it is kind of you can kind of twist yourself into a knot, but it's also quite a poetic knot that yields a lot of possibilities for artistic, you know, artistic, scientific, or at least cross-disciplinary experimentations or experiments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, a lot of the work that has come out of these projects that you've all had such an incredible hand in have spoken to the trouble or the problems of ascribing so much of human emotion or human reference to these species. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the friction of trying to find entryways into working with other species without trying to correlate every one of their actions to an action that humans take.
Well, I'll speak to, I kind of am more concerned with the opposite, which there's this primatologist who writes popular science books, Frans de Waal, who talks about anthropodenial, which is the kind of systematic underestimation of animal abilities. And he thinks we need to admit that animals are more like our relatives than machines. So I find myself often more concerned with the kind of the opposite personally.
Yeah, I think this is something that's come up in your work as well, Kyle, as you've been trying to decipher patterns in whale songs. You know, surely, I think, I mean, if anybody has dived into Kyle's blog posts around his work, you'll see just too many charts trying to determine how these patterns are correlated to historical composers and just demonstrative of just an incredible amount of intelligence in this species. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, from working with these decades of NOAA recordings, I guess the first challenge that I ran into was like these are not the same kind of recordings as what Annie played. The work I was doing before working with Annie was based on, you know, a microphone that was sitting on the bottom of the ocean that would be hearing humpbacks that were many miles away. Lots of engine sounds, lots of, you know, shrimp on the ocean floor that were snapping away. Yeah, so a big part of that project is really just about kind of hearing the humpbacks at all through the kind of noise and chaos and all of the composition of the ocean. Yeah, but once I got past some of that, yeah, I did start to find some of these patterns that are happening kind of at a larger scale across different humpbacks over time, and within the songs themselves. I mean, I'm really inspired by the research of people like Garland. What's her name, Annie?
Ellen.
Ellen, thank you.
Yeah.
Like Ellen Garland, who's been, you know, kind of marking up the humpback songs and trying to figure out exactly how the different structures are related, and researchers who are trying to understand, you know, whether humpback compositions are best understood as the way we understand kind of classical music, where it's a kind of score with repetition and you do one thing over and over, or whether it's better understood as a kind of probabilistic set of gestures that you sometimes do this one thing multiple times, sometimes you don't. Yeah, it really, you know, I'm not a bioacoustics researcher, so I was coming at this just from the perspective of trying to kind of let my ears be opened up by these machine learning algorithms. But the more that I dug into the bioacoustics research, it was clear that there's so much here to study as well. Yeah, I'm still learning a lot here.
Yeah, and I think thinking through the way that these sounds can be more than human, can be outside of the spectrum of just song and hit us on a visceral level as a species that are connected to other species. I think that kind of emotional connectivity really shows itself in the sun and the sea. I know, Lucia, this piece, this opera that you created, thinking about how emotionally evocative some of these composers are that Kyle just mentioned. It shows up in the beautiful piece that you created for the Venice Biennale. According to people who attended that piece, a lot of people left in tears. And I wonder, you know, is there a reason behind that? Where is the emotionality? Why is it hitting people in that particular way?
I was in Venice, really wondering to myself, was the art world having a nervous breakdown? Because everybody was coming in and staying for a lot longer than they previously said they would, and then coming out crying. And I really tried to get my head around it. Because obviously you see it so much in rehearsals that you maybe don't experience it in quite the same way. And you experience it with the nerves of making sure that all the mics are working and the lights are working. But over time, that piece, so the artist conceived that piece to be seen from the top down, partly inspired by, say, some kind of entomologist layout. So looking at the human species with a certain degree of remove, but not too much. So you're not a kind of satellite level, you're not at a kind of Google Maps, and not too close or at the same level. So you're not quite them, but you're sort of hovering. And the initial parallel was that they were trying to make was between these kind of tired, lazy, sprawling, tired bodies and the tired, let's say, body of the earth. But then there's all these other things that started emerging, particularly when the piece encountered the audiences, which had to do with, which perhaps hadn't been kind of intentionally coded into the work quite as, you know, forcefully or precisely, things to do with inaction, with kind of, you're looking from this place in which you can't do anything, but you've also been that person down there doing whatever it is that they're doing, and kind of occasionally thinking about climate disaster, but because it's not right there, it's sort of, I don't know, someone described it really well in an article. They said something like, this is the way, quoting, I believe, Eliot, this is the way the world ends, not with, you know, but with this kind of slow unfolding song. But then it has to be reckoned with the fact that that is a very specific and kind of geographically contingent experience of climate change, increasingly specific and increasingly privileged, because actually the climate catastrophe is experienced very directly by those more than humans and humans and more than humans persons at the front lines of that climate. So really those songs, as you move from kind of, it's hard to describe, but from kind of solo little fluttering thoughts through these choruses of songs that speak of eutrophication or that speak of jellyfish and dancing around plastic bags and so on, you realize that we're sharing something about this time, but we haven't found the kind of connected, or we're really looking for the connected tissue that allows for that, to recognize that we are sharing this time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yes, and we don't have, we have not mastered the communication that it takes to be able to rally around that in some ways, but certainly specific kinds of creatures seem to like pull a lot of that out of us, pull a lot of that kind of like heartfelt energy out of us. And I think it shows up as well, Annie, in your work, the chimes duet. I can't help but think about this in correlation to what Lucia is describing, these beautiful compositions in cathedrals and basilicas, you know, these structures that are the size of whales, emitting sounds from these creatures and hitting people in different kinds of like resonant series of emotions. And I would love for you to like share a little more about that with us, but also describe how it made people feel.
Yeah, thank you so much. So people responded to, they're quite emotional responding to that as well. And I think it speaks to a little bit of when we listen to whales now, in this idea of like the unintended consequences of this period of history is really big. And people found it quite emotional, and it wasn't, and this kind of thinking has evolved, and I was really taken by how a kind of listening that a composer performer named Raven Chacon, how he used to describe these recordings that he made when he was at the Standing Rock protest in 2016. And he said that they were deep listening of emergency, not meditation. And I feel like that's such an incredible way of describing a listening experience. And for me, when I hear these whales, there's that kind of urgency, I think, in the listening experience. It's not this sort of meditative new age experience of humpback song, but it's speaking to something much bigger and much more urgent. And thinking about this too, together with all of you right now, with the anniversary of the COVID pandemic, and just seeing how people have actually organized quite quickly in 1 year's time to create several vaccines. It's like we know it can happen. We know that this potential for sort of large scale human collaboration can exist. And so I'm thinking about that right now too. And I'm also thinking about, and I'd love to hear all of you speak to, I'm thinking about when you create a piece of art, you curate a piece of art about climate change or environmental disaster, people are really drawn, people have all kinds of responses, but people it seems in my experience, people are not motivated by fear, and that experiences that create fear, or like newspaper articles that create fear, do not motivate the kind of sustained response that like climate change needs or something. And so and I feel like that's the power of a lot of songs of the humpback whales, that people are inspired by beauty. And I'd love to hear all of you speak about that, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, in my experience with, I've done a lot of work with kind of surveillance critical pieces. And there's quite a division within the new media art scene about whether the best way to address surveillance in society is by kind of exposing it and revealing how terrible it is, or by building alternatives. And one of these things is really easy to get attention for, and it's really easy to kind of find funding and platforms for presenting it, because it gets a lot of there's a lot of emotion that goes along with fear. It can be a lot of work to build a solution, or to just kind of show something that's like a beautiful alternative. And yeah, the work is not always something the audience or the artist is ready to put in. So hopefully, yeah, I think I'm with you, Annie.
So am I. And ultimately, I kind of, I spent, like you, spent so much time working with more than human thought that I become quite convinced that energies are also quite tangible and material things in the world. And so what do you want to pour into the world in bucketfuls? And that's definitely love. And so, and given that, Donna Haraway would talk about it as trouble. We are in the trouble, and I'm not entirely sure that we are at a place where, any given solution is going to solve anything in particular, but rather small individuals situated, very precise, very kind, very compassionate, and very connected, actually profoundly human, micro solutions here and there, and the sort of solidarities and mutual understandings that can exist between those micro solutions. It's actually a really, really, really complex mess. And as such, it requires a really complex, like I said before, like a kind of complex reweaving. And you don't do that by ripping everything and screaming. You do that by actually learning to love more, often more.
Yeah, an extraordinary extension of empathy, right? And I think that, and an ability to see yourself in things that are challenging to find like a resemblance in as well. And it's complicated to figure out how we do that en masse, because we haven't even really perfected doing that within our own species. We haven't really perfected figuring out how to care for one another. We see that even in climate justice, right? The way that it's challenging to empathize, it seems at least challenging for politicians to empathize for people who are experiencing like the extraordinarily negative effects of climate change, which are, to be honest, like quite a lot of Black and brown people. And you think about the way that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talks about the pollution in the Bronx, and how many times she has to talk about those things in order for people to feel empathetic and connected to those issues. And I think that you know, when we're thinking about these kinds of variants of empathy and how that translates into interspecies work, I also think, you know, Lucia, you've said it yourself in your writing as well, that a lot of the work that we're considering and a lot of the work that's showing up in this work, in this artwork, is sitting on top of a foundation of knowledge that exists in marginalized communities, in indigenous communities, and communities that have brought forward a lot of lessons about the way that we engage ethically with other species. And I'm wondering how what are the methods of trying to engage at this level as scientists, as artists, as technologists? These are fields that don't have an enormous amount of representation for Black, Brown, and Indigenous identities. How do you center those kinds of philosophies? How do you center that kind of ideology in your work?
I mean, I can maybe speak very briefly to what a few of the things that you were referring to, Ashley, which brings us back to the question of anthropocentrism. When you spend a lot of time with, you know, trying to be thorough in your research and accurate in the messages and the activities that you do, it becomes overwhelmingly evident that the ecological crisis, colonial violence, the movement of products and services, that all of those end the enslavement of people, they're all stacked on top of one another. Literally, the routes are the same around the world. I mean, the cables that transport data follow the exact same route. And so when we talk about anthropocentrism, we talk about a set of disciplines, the humanities, that emerge by and large out of the Enlightenment, out of the European Enlightenment, without realizing that that kind of quite abstract blooming of philosophical concepts and of sort of, you know, that abstract also building of the bourgeois human, let's say, of the human in that definition, was funded by the mining of gold and the enslavement of indigenous people in South America, right? So that there's a direct correlation between, and this is something that scholars like Catherine Newsoff or Elizabeth Povinelli remind us, there's a direct correlation between the abstract notion of the human and the destruction of humans elsewhere. And so when we talk about the more than human, we're not only talking about a project that is actually anti-human. I consider it a profoundly humanistic project, but just a humanistic project that takes into account the devastating and long, kind of prolonged effect and repeating effect of imperialism.
For me, I'm trying to have kind of more conversations with people who have more ancient relationships with the more than human. Sometimes that just means, you know, reading more and listening more, but also talking to people directly. I've been trying to reach out to some folks in East Australia called the Wapabura, who are on an island out there where they've been kind of in conversation with and noticing and observing the humpback whales who are in that area. There's some other folks in kind of Northeast Canadian area between the Greenland and Canada who have their own relationships with humpbacks around there. And I think there's, I'm just learning more from being aware. I think that what you were just saying, Lucia, about all of these things being connected, that resonates with me, because I think in this process of reaching out to kind of find more of these perspectives that I wasn't aware of previously, I'm starting to see that, like, the humpback's perspective is one of those perspectives. And yeah, I think a lot about this story behind Songs of the Humpback Whale, as, you know, the release of that record being like the first time that people heard humpbacks. And I think about, you know, how it's kind of impossible to ignore them when, like you were saying, Annie, you're out there and you can hear their voice resonating through the whole. And I think about all the people who did hear humpbacks before this record was released, and kind of what their understanding is of those songs. So yeah, I guess the short answer for me, the process is just kind of having more conversations and kind of opening up myself to more perspectives that I was not familiar with.
Yeah, and including the whale as one of those perspectives is really spectacular. And I think opens us up to a myriad of conversations around empathy, but certainly also around consent. You know, thinking around the great care and operations of love that have brought you to this work, and how to extend that into the applications and the methodologies of that work. And I think that the aspects of consent have shown up in your work in particular many times, Kyle. As a creative technologist working with machine learning, consent often comes up. And I think it's correlated to a quote you have about working on Face Work, which was a game that you that you worked on in collaboration with several other creative technologists. And in this work, you described a relationship to ethical boundaries. With my personal ethical boundaries, I'd like to do this work in a way that is completely consensual in reference to facial recognition, without taking advantage of anyone for the sake of art. I haven't been able to personally live up to my own standard yet, because many of the face analysis tools that I work with in order to critique these systems are themselves built on data collected non-consensually. And I think that there's so much to be just peeled and stuck right on top of this work with interspecies, a species that cannot consent or cannot express consent in the same way that we might be able to perceive. How do you go around operating consent or even seeking consent from a species that doesn't communicate the same way that we do?
Man, we were talking about this before this call and last week, and it's so present on my mind. And I wonder about, what does it mean to, Annie and I are talking about potentially going kind of south of Greenland for another project where we'd make some recordings. And I've just been thinking, like, what does it mean to take a boat out there and burn that fuel? And who is it that gets to decide that it's okay to burn that fuel for this project? Are we in a position where it's okay? Like, we get to decide? I'm thinking about all the people who can't, all the creatures who can't say, like sign off on that decision. But yeah, one of the things that's come up in our discussion as we've been talking about this before this call was the idea of kind of sort of interspecies balance and awareness. And I really wonder if consent is the right framework for talking about interspecies collaboration and interspecies relations, or if it's more something akin to, Lucia, you mentioned Haraway, her idea of these kind of string figures, of these kind of noddings that we make in our own lives and relations, and then kind of pass them back and forth between each other. Maybe there's a kind of care and love in those relationships that we can build, which is different than consent or asking for consent or receiving consent, but it's more about a kind of loving awareness. And sometimes maybe in our case, like with Annie and I, it's more about being a kind of cautious advocate or someone who's kind of just trying to be aware and spread that awareness.
Yeah, Annie, I'd love to build on that with you, because in some of your work, you've also talked about the importance of not just extracting this beauty and distributing it to the human race, but really trying to find some kind of way to have the whales benefit from this work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had really great conversations with Kyle about this especially, but thinking that we can't, again, thinking about sort of our responsibility to these other animals, and it's more than humans. And for us, that has been, a lot of people don't know about the kind of major issue that bycatch is, and we're in the midst of searching for meaningful ways to include that in Siren. And I think that was one of the amazing, this speaks to the Payne's work and the huge network of conservationists they work with. But there was the record, but then it was absolutely all this legwork of going to the International Whaling Commission, organizing internationally the Save the Whales movement that got, led to the moratorium on whaling. So there was, the beauty and there was the work. And I think finding ways for those to exist hand in hand feels like a good way forward.
I think when we were having a sort of preliminary conversation before this, I think, Annie, you must have mentioned this, the notion of cautious advocacy perhaps being a more possible or more appropriate, not appropriate, but just a more possible way of approaching the notion of consent in the case of a kind of translation gap. And I wonder, it led me to wonder at the time, and it leads me to wonder now about all those occasions in which we actually do know what the boundaries of consent are without being expressly told. You know, again, in the case of the vulnerability and of infants, in case of, you know, if we're ever responsible for the care of someone who's no longer able, you know, who's in any kind of situation in which sort of specific symbolic communication through language happens. In the first Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish event, we started it thinking about, you know, really technological means through which to achieve direct translation between species. And it kind of slid over the course of the symposium, it sort of slid. And by the end, I had this feeling like, oh, so maybe caring for and spending time with is a much broader possible definition of what communicating is. And you start to realize it because, you know, I live with quite a lot of plants and I'm not very good at taking care of them, which means that they tell me how they feel all of the time. They change so much in relation to how they feel. And I very rarely know how to fix it, but I do see that there's kind of messages there. And so it's this length of time and this tending to that creates the possibility of relationality, not necessarily a kind of pre-agreed language of consent, or I mean, in the absence of that, there are other ways.
Absolutely. And it somebody, Helen, just wrote in the chat the relationship between care and consent according to Ken and Geiser's practice, speaking to the act of listening and asking for permission from not only peoples, non-human animals, plants, and lands, and recognizing when you're not welcome and leaving at that point, which I think is very much to what you're describing, Lucia, as well. And I think this is a really beautiful moment to open it up to questions from the room. I have just been seeing this incredible flurry of messages all the way through. And, you know, Annie, I don't know if you noticed, but there was a request to have Power Whale be your next band's name. And I think there are a few others in there as well. And so if you do have a question for the panel, we would love to see you voice it in the chat, and we can send that over to the panelists. I think in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to emerge, I would love to talk a little bit about the functionality of some of the technology underneath the work that we've described. And Kyle, if you could talk a little bit about UMAP and how your work in depicting some of these different, you know, the data of depiction in these whale songs, I think that would be really beautiful while we wait for questions.
I hope it will be beautiful too, but it'll definitely be technical. So this Umap algorithm we keep mentioning, I do think the best description is, like I said, it's this kind of jigsaw puzzle organizer. It's like you throw out all the pieces on the table. Some of them look kind of similar, so you put them together. Some of the others look kind of similar. You put them in another pile. That's all that Umap does, and you can give it all kinds of data. It's one kind of algorithm within a class of broader possibilities called nonlinear dimensionality reduction algorithms. It's a mouthful, but basically all it means is taking something that's really a set of things that are kind of complicated and laying them out in what's called a lower dimensional space, like a 2D space, like on a table, or sometimes in like a 3D space, like in a volume. So a 3D version of UMAP would be like taking the jigsaw pieces and clustering them kind of in these kind of spherical blobby areas. What we do with or what I've been doing recently with the recording set Annie's had is we basically have this collaborative relationship where Annie has been kind of tagging some of the recordings to say, here's the sound that's being made at this specific moment. You know, there's a kind of vocabulary to Humpback Whale songs. They have these units or phonemes that they make that are somewhat interchangeable, but have slight variations depending on the singer and where in the song it's being sung. So Annie's been tagging some of those, and we're talking about why we tag them certain ways and to what resolution and what kind of, what does it mean for two sounds to be the same, or what does it mean for them to be different? How do we decide that versus how does the humpback think of similarity or difference? And can we even know that or navigate that? So there's this kind of manual tagging process, and then there's this automated process of taking these tagged sounds and letting UMAP lay them out in space in a very gestural way. Traditionally, the most common way of visualizing sounds is with something called a spectrogram, where it's a kind of spatial visualization that plays out over time on one axis, and then over frequency on another axis. So if you have a sound that goes like ooh, then it would be a line that kind of goes like this. So the frequency is rising and the time is increasing. And if you had a sound that goes whoop, 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 it would look like whoop, 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 like that. That's the kind of traditional humpback visualization technique, and Katie used it and Roger used it, and a lot of other researchers use it today. But we're exploring something that's a little more gestural and less kind of like objective or like scientific. We're trying to do something that captures the shape of the gestures without necessarily ascribing a specific importance to the frequency. I mean, when you listen to me speaking, and my pitch is changing wildly, in English, it's not a pitched tonal language. The pitch is not a significant component to the semantics, but it's really important to understanding, like, the feeling behind what I'm saying and the emphasis. And so we're trying to listen to these humpback songs in a way that doesn't kind of splat them on a screen as being like, oh, the pitch is the most important thing, but sort of takes the entire sound into account, the timbre, the speed, and lets it all kind of sort of speak for itself in some way, in the sense that a machine learning algorithm can be a little more hands-off than a system like, spectral visualization. So that's kind of where we are right now, and it's continuing to evolve.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And there are two really spectacular questions in the chat. Just one tiny question that was just direct messaged to me is, I'm just wondering if the context of the whale contributes to how you're visualizing or mapping the sound. Because I know, Annie, you mentioned right at the beginning, one of the sound files that we played was right before a whale breached. And I wonder if the circumstance that the whale is in, it is related to any of the ways that you're kind of contextualizing these sounds and the emotions behind that sound.
So that was a really unique experience in my in my limited experience recording whales. But typically, I mean, they sing while stationary, they're underwater, they're nearly upside down, and they come up to breathe between songs. And so I would see them with the group I was with, only there's a sound that sort of sounds like popcorn popping that they make right before they come up to breathe. And so when we were out first thing in the morning, we'd lower the hydrophone just kind of like wherever, and then we'd have our binoculars on, sort of scanning the horizon. Then we heard this popcorn popping sound. We would really be looking, all of us, and if we saw a whale come up to breathe, we thought maybe, it's the male humpbacks that sing, maybe he was the singer. So we kind of get closer. But that was the extent that I saw many of the singers. But I was with this, amazing Hawaiian Marine Mammal Consortium, and they took, so when these whales would come up to breathe, they do a few shallow dives and then a deep dive, and on their deep dive, the fluke comes up, so the tail, and they would take pictures of the tail, and the tail functions, the fluke, as like a fingerprint, so no two are alike. So we know that we have recordings of these singers that are these distinct individuals, and chances are they probably would be anyways, because there are 10,000 whales singing there, but it was really special. So we know the individual identities of these different singers. But there was just once that this whale suddenly became very active on the surface, and he was raising his pec fins, and we became really animated, and it was phenomenal. But otherwise, it was kind of limited to these short shallow dives and then a deep dive.
Right. Thanks. That's really helpful. And I all of these things layered in storytelling also helps to kind of paint a picture of how these experiences existed, which is really lovely. A question in the chat. So I'm going to read these aloud. They're quite long, but I think it's worth reading all of the text that has come into these questions. So Nancy asks, almost all of the panelists have mentioned issues that are at their roots theological, creativity, generatively, consent, power, powerlessness, inversion, compassion, generosity, to name a few. How do you address these issues from a theological point of view, or do you?
Having mentioned a lot of those things and theologians in the first 2 minutes, I probably feel like I should speak to that. There's a really fantastic anthropologist called Marisol de la Cadena who wrote a book called Earth Beings, in which she discusses the specific Andean interrelation between, she would never say this, between people and mountains. She would say between Runacuna and Tiracuna. And the fact that they're not two beings in front of one another, but actually a mutual and ongoing process of becoming in relation with one another. And she speaks about, she mentions, there's a fantastic article called Religion, but Not Only. She mentions a moment in which, sort of historical period in which colonial, let's say, imperialist power arrives in a place, recognizes, sees, perceives, whatever, encounters a whole complex series of practices that involves all of existence. Call it religion. And by calling it religion, foreclose all the ways in which those practices also have to do with ecology, with medicine, with ancestral knowledge, with. And so she uses the term not only to kind of see how these things kind of spill out of their books and into just the deep time accretion of knowledge. And so those things, it's interesting that you would describe them as theological, because they could also have to do with art. But then maybe art is itself implicated in this whole kind of big set of techniques through which we remember our ancestors and our relationship with each other and with the planet, right? That maybe art is actually one of those elements that still, we're calling them poetry, art, mythology, spirituality, religion, whatever, but they might all actually belong to the same kind of repeated remembering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's correlated to this question around ancestral identity and ancestral remembering. Barbara asks, I'm interested in the notion of ocean memory and ocean history, and was stunned to hear about the amount of recordings. I wonder about constructing a piece that captures the same humpbacks or descendants of a couple animals as a way of speaking across time, like honoring the voice of ancestors. What do you think, Annie or Kyle? I know you're probably quite close to this as a thought process.
So when I think of ancestral singing, Ellen Garland, who Kyle spoke about earlier, and through a colleague of mine, Alex South, who I think is here today, I've learned they're working on, I believe they're working on identifying singers and descendants of singers, and through means that I'm not totally familiar with. So in Hawaii, the conditions are very favorable for getting fluke IDs, for example, and knowing the identities of the singers. In other parts of the world where humpback populations live, I know it's quite difficult to get close enough to know the identity of a singer, and so kind of knowing sort of lineage in a family is, I think, quite a bit more complicated. But Ellen Garland, if you'd like to look her up, is doing research on this, and Alex South, who's here, perhaps if he wants to chime in on the chat, could offer a bit as well. Thank you.
I also pasted a link to a paper from Ellen in the chat called Dynamic Horizontal Cultural Transmission of Humpback Whale Song at the Ocean Basin Scale, which is amazing. They have some plots in there showing kind of how they've managed to track exactly what Annie's describing, this cultural transmission from one population to another around the world. Yeah, I think this idea of ocean memory is really salient for me, especially when you're looking at things like bowhead whales that live 200 years and store, in the structure of their baleen, like tree rings, the composition and acidity and other kind of material kind of histories in their body, for decades even, like in their mouth. Can you imagine like storing history in your mouth? And I think about the ecosystems that spring up around whale falls. When a whale dies and falls to the bottom of the ocean, sustains an entire collection of other creatures, and how long that lasts. And I think there's these really deep relations between living and dying and embodiment and kind of structure, like chemical and material reconfigurations. And besides these cultural transmissions that happen from living creature to living creature, there's also these material transmissions. And I don't have any answer there or something like profound to say, but just I'm learning more about all these connections. And the web is so tight.
But it makes me wonder whether we can think of like song or indeed art as the kind of human equivalent of tree rings.
Definitely.
Just because one is considered to be a material and the other one is considered to be material ontological. I mean, that's a distinction that we've decided to make somewhat arbitrarily, probably in the 18th century. So I think
and who knows to what extent these songs are even materially kind of stored in the structures of our brains. And it's anyway.
Wow. We're gonna have a whole another panel just on that alone. That's really incredible. There are two more questions I want to grab before we close. Helen asks, or Helen says, I'm interested in hearing more about not only listening to whale songs in its singularity, but within their environment. I'm thinking about how human language means different things depending on context, and I wonder how environment also alters the relations between animals, whales here. So how the whale, its body movement, its song, and other species are all connected in a relation with the communication strategies. Does that come up in practice or curatorial strategy? Who's gonna take a stab at this complex question? We can maybe we can ruminate on it for a moment, and then we'll just jump to. We have one really beautiful question from someone in the room that is wondering, I guess, on a more personal note, how you might approach these kinds of things. So Simone asks, what do you hope for or imagine for cross-species or interspecies communication? What would you want to talk about with whales or birds?
I can actually, maybe the question just before is interesting
Sure.
to come back to for a second, because it's reminding me of some things I heard when I was listening to the NOAA data around echoes, and being uncertain a lot of the time whether I'm hearing a literal physical echo of a whale song off of some some undersea cliff, or whether I was hearing another whale that was kind of happened to be echoing the primary singer I was listening to, or was purposefully echoing. And Annie, I know you've done a lot of thinking about these like SOFAR channels, and that as being a kind of an environmental kind of structural feature that maybe the whales or humpbacks especially are taking advantage of. Maybe you can mention that for a second.
Kyle, you got me good. I am not a scientist. But I could recommend, I'll put a link in the chat to the SOFAR channel. So it's important to keep in mind, I think, when we're talking about marine mammal communication, that they can't see beyond like their own tails in the water, right? And so their acoustic communication is how they survive, facilitates all aspects of their survival. And so, you know, we're very visual creatures. And so I think that for me, like when I was in the water, listening to the humpbacks, if you're close enough, you actually feel, I mean, it's so loud. And I mean, it's interesting when we think about in this, you know, discussion about consent too, I was thinking about, because you can't, like in the water, you know, I was nowhere near a humpback too, and I could hear it singing, like it's very loud and it just sort of saturates the whole soundscape of the water, and it's really phenomenal, and it felt like such a celebration of life, or that kind of is how it struck me listening, and I felt also like the privilege that I was able to hear it, that I was in Hawaii listening. And so I think a big motivator for my project was just to bring that thrill to, you know, to people who have not yet heard that in the water, or who are unable to. And I think I've said all that to get away from the so far question. But what was the question again, Ashley? Sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. They're both they're both heavy questions. I'm just scrolling up to recount it as well. So the core of the question that Helen asks, I believe, how the whale, its body movement, its song, and other species are all connected in relation to communication strategies. How that environment also alters the relation between animals. And the way that they create their songs and their language, and whether that comes up at all.
I would like to say one thing that I think is related. So as we're talking about climate change as well, so bowheads sing a very interesting song that perhaps has less in common with human laws of musical composition, so maybe hasn't taken the world by force yet, but Kate Stafford, a marine scientist, gave this really wonderful paper that I heard last year, talking about how as the Arctic warms, humpbacks are leaving these higher latitudes later and are singing longer around the Arctic. And she was wondering how if there might be influence on each other's songs between bowheads and humpbacks as they begin singing and they kind of are in the same territory for the singing months. And so I think it's kind of interesting to think ahead about how these species might affect each other's songs as we look ahead to a warming world.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think, Lucia? I can see you ruminating on that as well.
Well, no, it led me on a whole other, how do you say, garden path of thinking about curatorial strategy in relation to like presentation and context. And I think what I could say, which is a completely different way of interpreting the question, but I think the only thing that I could say to that fits within a 30-second answer is that what we try to do very often when we're trying to present these kind of various disciplinary positions on some quite complicated stuff is to use more of a cosmological approach than a kind of logical one. So throw out lots of different standpoints, some of which are like very embodied and are experiential, and others that are more, let's say, you know, that might be like a scientific paper or, again, theologian. But to try, the hope is that as you're throwing all these things into the air, kind of like stars, that the constellations that are then being created into each audience member might be different from each other, but that you might be sharing so that everyone might walk away with a different kind of three-dimensional object, but with the sense that you've all held them in place for a period of time together. So that something happens between you as audience members, but it might not always be necessarily the same thing or the exact same thing. And so that's where context is really important, because it's about also how you bring those perspectives together and not just a kind of delivery of material or art or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think that is a really incredible place to pause. It feels like a call to action. If it wasn't intended to be, it feels like we could translate it in that way. And I just wanted to thank all three of you for such an invigorating conversation and really creating a lot of expansive thought around empathy, consent, motherhood, humanhood, more than humanness. And I think that there's just so much to chew on from this. I mean, since our preliminary talk, I've been ruminating on this each day, and I can't imagine anyone walking away with anything less than that today. So thank you so much for your insight and your beautiful creative practices. I'm going to just pass it over to Kay to close out with some mentions around upcoming endeavors as well. So thank you, and over to Kay.
Thank you, Ashley. Well, I'm incredibly moved. So I'm sort of speechless a bit, but I just wanted to refer back to a few things. Some amazing things were said. Art is possibly techniques which we experience memory beyond the human, and art science. This came in as the chat. Art science and theology have their own special spirituality, and Annie's reference to watching the whales and knowing which one sings which. So anyway, it was incredibly moving. I'm really grateful to all of you. I found it wonderful. And the embodiment conversation at the end leads right to our next conversation about the imagination and the scientist and machines, the intelligence of machines not having a body anymore. So we'll talk about that notion of embodiment and what does that mean, in every way. So I invite you the April 18th to join us, and hopefully all of these folks will be at the Neuroverse Festival, and so I look forward to seeing you all there, and I can't thank you all enough. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Kay. And thank you, Ashley, and both you, Lucia and Annie.
And to the audience, please
Fair
vote.
time.
I should say, responsibly, I should say, we try to pay all our scientists and artists. We need your help. If you feel the urge, please go on our website and donate to Max. We are a nonprofit, but we are committed to paying people a decent wage for their contribution. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this time.
Yeah, lovely to share space with you all.
Thank you, everyone. It's great.
Thank you.